If you love historical fiction that leans towards literary, books about women, about communities, about isolation, with unforgettable settings and ordinary lives, novels that immerse you so deeply into the setting that the characters feel very vivid, then I genuinely recommend that you should be reading Hannah Kent. Her catalogue is actually very small, with 3 novels and 1 memoir. But I think that every single one of her books is well worth your time. So today I want to convince you to pick up Hannah Kent if you have never done so before. And perhaps more importantly, I want to share with you the pathway that I would recommend if I were discovering her work for the first time. Hannah Kent is an Australian author and she has only written 3 historical fiction novels, but I do feel that she deserves to be amongst some of the finest contemporary historical fiction writers of today. Not because her books are the same as theirs, but because her work provides something that is surprisingly very rare in historical fiction. And that is that when I think back on her novels, I don't just remember the stories. I remember the silence of these remote communities, the landscapes that shape the people that are living in them, and the feeling of having visited somewhere that was previously unfamiliar. And for me, that is what some of the best historical fiction does. It doesn't just recreate the past, but it allows you to inhabit that time. Part of that comes from Hannah Kent's extraordinary research. You can tell she has done her homework in these novels. But unlike some historical fiction where the facts start to take over the story and the atmosphere, she really applies it so lightly that you forget that it is there. So instead of feeling like you're learning a history lesson, you really do feel that you're living inside of it. Her novels I think that they are very emotionally restrained, which is an interesting thing to say because I feel all the feelings when I read Hannah Kent. She never relies on melodrama or dramatic twists to create emotion or tension. I think that she trusts that ordinary lives that are put through extraordinary circumstances carry enough weight for the story. And I think that's why her books have such a long-lasting emotional impact for me. And then there is her prose. It is so beautiful, sometimes achingly beautiful, but it never feels ornamental. Every single sentence builds atmosphere, reveals character development, and draws you more deeply into this world that she has created. And that's why I keep returning to her novels. These are not the books that you want to race through over a weekend. They really do invite you to slow down, to fully pay attention, and just inhabit this one place for a period of time. There really isn't a bad place to start with her books, but I think there is a pathway that will deepen your experience with her books, and that's what I want to share with you today. If you're new to Hannah Kent, I would 100% recommend that you start with her debut novel, Burial Rites. This was published in 2013, and I really can't think of a better book to read first to get an understanding of who she is as a writer and what you can expect from her in her other books. The novel is actually based on the true story of a woman named Agnes Magnusdóttir, who was the last woman in Iceland to be executed. And from the beginning, you know what the ending is going to be. You know what Agnes's story finishes like. But I do think the power of Burial Rites isn't so much focused on the what, but on the who and the how. And this is one of those rare novels where the landscape and the setting feel inseparable from the story itself. The harsh Icelandic winters, the very cramped living quarters, the isolation of the valley creates an atmosphere that lingers long after you finish the book. It's also a perfect example of something I mentioned earlier, where Hannah Kent never makes you feel like you're having a history lesson. The research is there on every page, but I wouldn't say that it draws attention to itself. Instead, it quietly supports the story, which allows the characters to feel very, very real throughout the book. And I think that's what I remember most when I think back on Burial Rites. It's not about the history, but about the humanity that comes through. Kent takes this moment in history where a woman is remembered only because of her ending, and she somehow slowly restores her humanity. Some of my favourite moments in this book are not really what you would call plot points. They're the quiet relationships that Agnes starts to form as she is waiting her execution date. These relationships are the slowest of slow burns, and they are almost imperceptible as they start to develop because of forced proximity with these cramped quarters through shared work, and she allows them to unfold so naturally that by the end of the novel, the emotional weight of those relationships feels completely earned. I do think it's one of the most beautiful and finest examples of historical fiction I've ever read, and I had the very good fortune of choosing this book for my very first read-along last year, and I think I'm safe to say that it floored absolutely all of us. And if you participated in the read-along, just give me a thumbs up if you agree with me. But almost at the same time we were reading this book, Hannah Kent published her memoir, Always Home, Always Homesick. And I remember taking a deep breath after finishing Burial Rites and wanting to jump straight into her memoir. I wasn't ready to leave Iceland, and I think more importantly, I really wanted to understand how an Australian author had written a debut novel that felt so completely at home in 19th century Iceland. So in her memoir that was published in 2025, Hannah Kent takes us back to the moment when she was 17 years old and she went to Iceland on an exchange. And these are the kind of memoirs that make me wish I had kept my journals as a teenager. Hannah Kent recalls these foundational moments of hers with such clarity, you can kind of see how it was starting to form the writer that she was going to become, long before she knew what her purpose and her journey was going to be. And it was on that exchange that she first heard of the story of Agnes Magnusdóttir. And then years later, she returned back to Iceland to research what would eventually become Burial Rites. Through her exchange year, she fell deeply in love with Iceland, with the people, with the culture. And once you read her memoir, you can really see how that love of place found its way into Burial Rites. For me, though, I think that if you're a new reader to Hannah Kent, Burial Rites and Always Homesick, Always Home, Always Homesick feel as though they're in conversation with one another. Each one illuminates the other. Neither book depends on the other one, but when you've read both of them, and if you do it like I did, which is back to back, it makes both of them so much richer. And I think reading Burial Rites first means that by the time you come to the memoir, you're no longer reading simply about Hannah Kent's year in Iceland or her travel back afterwards. You're recognizing the valleys that you've already walked through with Agnes, the history you've encountered, and the customs and settings that are already very, very familiar. So now, having read both of them and having read her memoir after Burial Rites just feels so much richer because I understand Hannah's journey to the story. And looking back, I think that's exactly what happened during our read-along. Before we even finished Burial Rites, so many of us were immersed in the Icelandic landscape. I honestly did not know a whole lot about Iceland before reading Burial Rites, although it's always been somewhere I want to go. But as we were reading Burial Rites, in the read-along, someone actually shared some photos they had come across about the turf houses that were described in Burial Rites. And then when a hymn was mentioned in Burial Rites, I managed to track it down online and also shared that with everybody. We all wanted to step a little further into this world that Hannah Kent had created. But one of the things that I appreciate about the memoir is that Hannah Kent doesn't shy away from a couple of very important questions. And that is, how does an Australian author write such an immersive novel set in 19th century Iceland? And also, does she have the right to do so? But rather than avoiding these questions, she really does approach them with a lot of honesty. And the memoir doesn't justify Burial Rites or explain it away. Instead, it gives you a very unique look into the years of research and the curiosity and respect that Hannah Kent genuinely had for Agnes and her love of Iceland that made the novel possible. And the truth is, if it wasn't for Hannah Kent, I may never have come across the story of Agnes. But I do think it's a beautiful memoir in its own right, especially if you are someone who appreciates a look into authors' minds. Because it is about creativity, it is about belonging, also what it means to have your heart divided into two places, to always feel the pull of one home while you are living in another. Reading these two books back to back was one of the most richest reading experiences I had had in a long time, and if you have not read either of them, I highly recommend you read Burial Rites and follow it up with Always Home, Always Homesick. So after that incredible experience, I didn't actually pick up a Hannah Kent book for almost a year, partly because I wanted to sit with that incredible experience with Burial Rites and Always Home, because they felt so complete together that I was not in a rush to hurry along to her next book. But when I did eventually return, I picked up The Good People. It was the obvious choice for me to pick up next, and I do think it is a logical next step if you are new to Hannah Kent. This book was published 4 years after Burial Rites. And I think after reading this book, it really did solidify the fact that Burial Rites was not a fluke. It was not lightning in a bottle. It was really proof of her skill as a remarkable writer. So this time, Hannah Kent leaves behind Iceland for 19th century rural Ireland. The novel follows a widow who is caring for her grandson, who she suspects has been placed there, that he is a changeling, put there by the good people who are the fairy folk. This book draws on Irish folklore and a real historical case, and it's a story that is shaped by grief and superstition and a search for answers. From the very first pages, I knew that Hannah Kent had done it again. Immediately, here was another world that felt completely inhabited. A different landscape, a different history, different customs, different beliefs, different fears. And yet it had the same remarkable ability to transport me away to this place, just like Burial Rites did. And once again, what stayed with me really wasn't the plot. It was the atmosphere, it was the humanity and the vulnerability, the emotional restraint, and the quiet confidence of Hannah Kent. And I think that's a lot harder than we actually give writers credit for. Plenty of authors write one extraordinary novel, but I think far fewer can follow it up with one that is just as convincing, just as immersive, without repeating themselves. And The Good People never feels like Hannah Kent is rewriting Burial Rites. Everything about it is different in terms of the people and the customs and the beliefs, and yet the experience of reading it is unmistakably hers. So Burial Rites introduced me to Hannah Kent, but The Good People proved that Burial Rites wasn't just an extraordinary exception. It convinced me that she had set a standard for herself as a writer. And I think after reading The Good People was when I kind of told myself that I will read anything this woman puts out. And the final book that I would recommend is, well, it's her last book in her current catalogue. It's Devotion. Now, I have happened to recommend all of her novels in the order they were published. And I think the reason, I didn't realize I had done it until after, but the reason I would suggest to hold off Devotion until last would be because I think it is her most ambitious novel. It's initially set in Prussia in the 1830s, and it follows a young girl named Hannah who is growing up in a very protected Lutheran community. Her life becomes intertwined with another young woman that comes to live in the town, and eventually this community is forced to leave the area because of religious persecution. So they leave Europe and they embark on a treacherous boat trip to South Australia. More than her other novels, I think Devotion really, for me, made me think about how Hannah Kent writes more than just what she writes. Her prose isn't there to impress you as the reader, it is part of the storytelling. I think it is what makes the characters and the landscape so vividly alive. And when I read this book, I shared that I felt like reading this book and Hannah Kent's writing in particular, it feels like watching Technicolor for the first time. There is something about it. There is a way that she is able to bend words into sentences that I never would have thought possible. I just appreciated that prose so much more. I think one of the joys of reading an author's catalogue is that you start to see their confidence as a writer grow. As readers, we're growing alongside them. Every book strengthens the relationship and the trust between reader and writer. So eventually, when they do take that creative leap, we are willing and trusting enough to go along the journey with them. So by the time you reach Devotion, you've read 3 of her books and you know how she writes. You've come to trust her. You come to trust that she slows the pace for a reason. You trust that if she is asking you to pay attention to the landscape, that she is doing it for a reason because that is a part of the emotional story. And because she has earned that trust, she can now ask something different of you. And that's what makes Devotion feel really ambitious for me, and I didn't realize it until I was halfway through the book that was what was happening. So Devotion is a book where she does take a creative risk. This novel has an element of magical realism that I think would have felt quite jarring to me, and maybe I would not have been so eager to pick up her next books if there had been in her first one. But by this point, I wasn't really questioning where she was taking the story. I definitely did have to surrender to this moment in the book where I just had to be like, all right, I'm just gonna trust you and go along with an open mind. So by the time I really finished Devotion, I wasn't just admiring her writing and her skill and her research. I really did admire her confidence and her willingness to stretch herself, to experiment and to ask her readers to go somewhere different. And that's why I would leave Devotion till last, not because it's inaccessible, but because every book she has read prior to this kind of prepares you for this creative leap. And it is really a beautiful thing when I think about it, to look back and see how she has grown as a writer, and yet there are still all those incredible elements that I came to love in Burial Rites in all of her subsequent works. Hannah Kent's catalogue is exceptionally small, with her debut novel only published 13 years ago. And yet I genuinely believe that she has earned her place alongside other contemporary historical fiction writers like Maggie O'Farrell or Geraldine Brooks. You may pick up her books initially expecting immersive historical fiction, but like me, I think you'll end up staying for something a little different, which is the humanity. Hannah Kent has an extraordinary skill of taking these historical moments or people in history that may be reduced down to a single moment and restoring the complexity, their dignity and their voice. If you've never read her before, I really do hope that you'll start with Burial Rites, and if you read that one with us, I hope you have picked up a few other books of hers already. I would love to know if you have followed the same path I did or if you'll be picking them up soon. Thank you so much for joining me today. I will speak with you soon. Bye.